Okay, folks, if everybody finds a seat, I think we'll get started. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the 1st Division Museum, and I want to welcome you to Cantigny and tonight's presentation. If you haven't been here before, Cantigny is the historic estate of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune. This was his estate and his home. Second only to the Chicago Tribune in his heart was the 1st Division of the U.S. Army, with whom he served as a citizen soldier in World War I. He came home from the war and named this place Cantigny in honor of the little village in France where the 1st Division fought its first battle and America's first battle, not only of World War I, but for Europe. And he was devoted to veterans and soldiers and service members for the rest of his life. And so in that tradition, we have the 1st Division Museum. That's how the 1st Division Museum happens to be on Cantigny, and how our relationship through Colonel McCormick with the Tribune all fits together. The McCormick Foundation mission is to encourage and promote communities of engaged and informed citizens. And of all the responsibilities of citizenship, probably none is as profound as our common defense. And so in that vein, we think that the citizenry of a republic ought to know something about military affairs and their military history, and that's why we have this series of lectures here and talks and presentations and panel discussions and other forms of things having to do not just with the history of the 1st Division, but with America's history of defending the country. So that's why we're here. It is a great privilege for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Colonel U.S. Marine Corps retired, Jim Zumwalt. Jim is a veteran of both the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps. He's a veteran of the war in Vietnam. He also served in Panama in 1989 and in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. He had a distinguished career and retiring as a full colonel. He comes from a distinguished family of seafarers. Had a brother who served in Vietnam. Father and grandfather were naval officers. I may have all this wrong, so Jim, I apologize, and you can correct me later on. But a son who has served 2 tours, I think now, in Iraq. So I'm sure he's very, very proud of that strong tradition of service to our country in his family. Since his retirement from the Marine Corps, he has served in a variety of positions on boards and everything else, but he's a prolific writer and author. Many, many, many articles. If you Google him, you'll have plenty to read, and all of it, by the way, very insightful and extremely well constructed. Most of it on contemporary issues of American national security. He and he is a member of the Committee on the Present Danger. But tonight he's not going to talk about those. He's going to talk about his book that's shown there on the screen, Bare Feet and Iron Will. He's made several trips, not just those at government expense. He's made several trips to Vietnam after the shooting stopped to interview veterans of the other side. And that was the origin of his book and what he's learned. And I think that's critically important. The history of the war in Vietnam will not be properly written until historians can describe what our adversaries there were doing. And once we have that and we can synthesize that with the American and Allied story, we'll have a much better picture of the war in Vietnam. For myself, I do a little bit of research and a little bit of talking, nothing to compare with Jim's on the war in Vietnam, and because the 1st Division was there for 5 years, and it had a very, very profound effect on all the soldiers and veterans who served there. And the more I learn about that war, the more I have to acknowledge how tough our opponents were. It's very, very easy to sort of to caricature them as, little people in black pajamas that are out there in the jungle somewhere, and they were anything but. The main force, Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, whatever else they might have been, were hardened, tough, determined, dedicated soldiers. And that is part of the explanation why that was such a difficult war for the United States. I'll let Jim tell that story. He's far more expert than I am. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Jim Zumwalt to the stage at Canteen.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. As Paul indicated, my family has a tradition of military service going back to the American Revolution. And so it was with great pride when my son told me he got a 4-year NROTC scholarship to Tulane University. And I was intrigued to see whether he would decide to go Navy like his granddad or Marine like his dad. Halfway through his 4 years there, he made his decision, and he called me up and he said, "Dad, I made Dean's List." I said, "That's terrific, son. I'm proud of you." He said, "Yeah, but now I think I'm too smart to be a Marine." So for those of you who remember Rodney Dangerfield, I felt I got no respect. Although I did wonder how smart he was. He did go Navy EOD, bomb technician, and as Paul said, had 2 tours in Iraq, diffused over 180 roadside bombs, and became the 4th generation to be awarded received the Bronze Star. So I'm awful proud of him. Although he does keep sending me these packages that are ticking. I just forward them to my mother-in-law. The book I wrote, Bare Feet, Iron Will, I think it's important to know both what it is about and what it is not about. It is, as the title and subtitle indicate, stories of the experiences of those who served on the other side of the battlefield. I've taken some hit from my fellow veterans who served in Vietnam. They felt that this was an effort for me to glamorize the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. It was not. My only intention was to humanize them. And I took an interesting journey. It was an interesting journey for me, and I think it's important for you to know that this book was written at the end of the journey, so you need to understand what set me out on that journey. Every male member of my family served in the Vietnam War. My father commanded the naval forces in Vietnam. My brother was swift boat commander. I served there with the Marines. All of us returned unscathed, or so we thought. Several years later, my brother was diagnosed with lymphoma. And if you have lymphoma, usually it's one of 2 types, Hodgkin's lymphoma or non-Hodgkin's. He had both. He also had a child born with severe learning disabilities, a daughter born with 2 uteruses. He fit the profile of veterans who had been exposed to Agent Orange. My brother put up a valiant battle, but died. And when he died, I found I had a great emptiness in my heart. I was upset that the enemy we had fought there. I was upset with having gotten involved in that war. I found that when the tragedy strikes a family, there's 2 ways you can proceed. One is to take the low road, as I did, or one is to take the high road, as my father did. He threw himself into the Agent Orange issue. And for those of you that do not know his role, which was kind of the bitter irony for my family, it was my father who ordered the spraying of Agent Orange in Vietnam. The reason for it is, when he took command of the naval forces there, a sailor serving in those small waterways stood a 72% chance of being killed or wounded during a 12-month tour. 72% chance. That was totally unacceptable. My father found out that the Army was using Agent Orange to clear away foliage around their fire bases. He checked with the chemical companies to make sure that there were no adverse human effects. He was sure that was the case. He decided to use it. The casualty rate dropped from 72% to 6%. Think about that. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize the fact that that was a sound military decision based on the fact that he had been told by the chemical companies that there were no adverse human effects. The chemical companies, we later learned, lied. And evidence has been dug up that they knew long before it was used in Vietnam because it was being used by farmers in the Midwest who were coming down with various types of cancers. In 1994, my father decided to go back to Vietnam to meet with the president of the country to see if he could get him to agree to do a joint study on Agent Orange. He asked me if I wanted to go with him. This was 8 years after my brother had died. And I still had that anger in me. I did not initially want to go, but decided I would accompany him. We had a week of meetings. And as I listened to what was basically their veterans on the other side of the table, I found the anger welling up inside me. And on the third day, I was probably at a boiling point when I was asked to have a meeting with a former North Vietnamese general. He was a medical doctor. And he started off the meeting by extending his condolences for the loss of my brother. We started talking about the war and its impact. And as we did, I noticed he got a little teary-eyed. I later learned that he, too, had lost a brother. And when he shared that with me, it was kind of like a light went on. I asked myself, was the loss of a loved one any less significant just because it occurred on the other side of the battlefield? And the answer was clear. It was devastating to both of us. I had the advantage of being with my brother when he died. I knew the disposition of the remains. This general spent 17 years looking for the remains of his brother because it's very important in the Vietnamese culture that the body be returned to the village of birth. It continues the cycle of life. The spirit passes to the soil nurtures the crops are consumed by family members, and so it continues that cycle. After 17 years, he found what he believed was his brother's remains. I am skeptical of the fact because they did not have the ability to do the types of analysis that we could to determine whether or not it was a blood relative. But anyway, it brought him closure. But it was that conversation that caused me to rethink the anger I was feeling. And I told myself I had to return to Vietnam. I had to interview as many of their veterans as I could. I had to learn what the war was like from their side of the battlefield. And that was why I wrote Bare Feet, Iron Will. Let me share some of those stories with you this evening. One of the first people I interviewed was Dr. Lee Cao Dai. Dr. Dai was a colonel in 1965. He was ordered to form a field hospital and take it down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. His wife asked him how long he'd be gone. He said a year or two at most. He returned 6 years later. He formed that field hospital, took it down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was exposed to heavy bombings. By the time the field hospital got down south, they lost a lot of their supplies. But he had to look for replacement supplies and found a very unusual source, the U.S. government. At night, we were dropping parachute flares to monitor activity on the ground. The next day, he would send his soldiers out to collect these flares. The lines in the flares could be used as sutures. The parachutes could be used as bandages. The empty container could be used as a stethoscope. Whenever we left an area, they would look for glass soda bottles or beer bottles. They'd melt those down to make vials. If they came across a crash site of an aircraft, they would immediately strip it of everything that could be used. They took insulated wire, took the wire out of it, and used the rubber tubing as an IV tube. The piping in the aircraft would be cut, and then it would be cut in sections, and then cut in half so that it could be used as a brace for a broken arm or a broken leg. When they ran out of things that we were supplying them, they looked to Mother Nature. Young bamboo shoots were good for tracheotomies. They were low on writing supplies, so it was virtually impossible to keep medical records on patients. They took bigger pieces of bamboo, again, cut it in half, cut it in sections, put a string around it, put the string around the patient's neck, and wrote on the inside of the bamboo. And the medical record would then go with the patient. Their operating rooms were underground, but they had generators, but seldom had petrol to operate the generators. So they would hook a bicycle up to the generator, and soldiers would take turns pedaling the bicycle so that they can maintain electrical power for the surgery and for the surgical tools. Since they were unable to keep electricity on a 24/7 basis, doctors and nurses would donate their own blood because they could not refrigerate blood. You know, conditions that were totally unfathomable by us were a way of life for them. As far as food went, Dr. Dye said there was always ample food for the patients. They had plenty of rice for them, but the staff normally had to send out their own hunting parties, and they would kill whatever they could come across: monkeys, tigers, elephants. He explained when they shot their first elephant, they had difficulty cutting through the hide, and the surgeon suggested that they go to the belly of the elephant because the softest layer of skin was there, open it up, and then somebody crawled inside the belly of the elephant and started cutting from the inside out. He said the trunk and bottom feet of the elephant are the tastiest, so if you ever get that chance, you might keep it in mind. There was another gentleman I interviewed, another medical doctor, and to look at him, you wouldn't think he was a medical doctor. When I walked into the room, he immediately stood up, extended me his right hand, half of which was no longer there. And he in a very bragging fashion, showed me his 6 wounds he had received. 2 while fighting the French, 4 while fighting the Americans, with the most devastating wound being that hand wound. And he was not an infantry soldier, he was a brain surgeon. You know, unlike our medical people who were able to stay behind enemy lines and take care of our wounded, they often found their medical personnel having to go out into the trenches because they were low on personnel. He explained to me that when they marched through the jungles, it was not only the 2-legged armies they had to look out for. He said, quote, "There were a lot of insects, terrible insects in the jungle. Sometimes we came across millions of ticks. Sometimes we saw the ticks in long columns moving through the jungle. They were all around. If you stopped for a short time to remove them, others started taking their place. So we moved very quickly through the tick-infested areas. We discovered that ticks did not like water. We went into the water and did not have to worry about them. Once in the water, we only worried about the leeches and snakes." He also explained to me that a lot of times they did not have anesthesia. They had some Novocaine and could give Novocaine to a patient, but he actually was performing brain surgeries without anesthesia. And he explained to me how they would do it. He said they would give the patient Novocaine in the scalp to deaden the scalp. They then would cut the scalp back, exposing the skull. Then he would have to have a couple of soldiers hold the patient down, and he would start the surgery. And if the soldier was lucky, he would become unconscious early on in the operation. But he described having to drill. First of all, he said that they lacked the surgical drills. They basically were using a home drill. And the big difference there is a surgical drill only allows you to penetrate so far. Any other skill, you've got to have a lot of expertise and know what you're doing. He said that they would drill a series of holes in a circular pattern in the exposed skull. They would then take a piece of coarse wire. They would stick it through one hole, back up through the other, and in a saw-like fashion, start breaking away between the holes, and chips of the skull would come out. They then would perform the surgery on the brain, and they often did not even have a piece of metal they could put back in there, so they would simply sew the skin back across the open hole in the skull and send the soldier back up north for treatment. He said it was very difficult for him to do this and observe the pain that he knew his patients were in, particularly when the Americans and their allies had much better medical care awaiting for them. But he also said they had to do kind of what the Egyptians had to do long ago. And for those of you who know your Egyptian medical history, what they would do is amputations, and then they would have the patient stick the stump into a pot of boiling oil to seal it. These were conditions that the Egyptians endured in their day because they had to, and he said, that's what we were enduring in our day because we had to. I also got an opportunity to interview several mothers who had lost husbands and sons in the Vietnam War. Most of you will recall the incident involving the Sullivan brothers during World War II, when we lost 5 brothers on a cruiser, and the devastation that had on that one family. And because of that, supposedly, brothers were not to serve in the same units, combat units, again, although several have. The Vietnamese had no choice. One mother lost a husband and 2 sons, another a husband and 3 sons, another a husband and uncle and 5 sons. 1,400 mothers were called heroes. They got an award because they had lost 3 or more sons. One woman lost a husband, 9 sons, and a grandson. What amazed me was the stoicism of these mothers. Yes, it was a great personal loss, but they knew it was one they had to make for Vietnam. It reminded me of a story told during the French-Prussian War 100 years earlier, where the French army was defeated by the Prussians, and the French were deserting back to the village, and a mother waited in the village street for her son to return. And as the last French soldier came to the village and she didn't see her son, she looked up towards the sky and said, "Thank God he did not run away." But it was that mentality. Yes, it was a personal loss, but it was one for the motherland. One of the areas that I think we really haven't heard much about, we've heard about it from our side, the MIA issue, but not much of anything from the Vietnamese side. I think as of the most recent count, we probably have still probably about 2,100 Americans who are unaccounted for. The Vietnamese have 300,000. And if you put that as a ratio to the populations of the U.S. and North Vietnam in 1975 when Saigon fell, it works out to about 1 in every 10,000 Americans who were affected by an MIA. It works out to 1 in 83 Vietnamese being affected by an MIA loss. Vietnam is an amazing country. I wish I had done more about learning its history before I went over there to serve. But they had enormous ingenuity. They showed it against us, but as I was commenting earlier, I think it's in their DNA. It's been something that they've exhibited in the 1,000 years of their independence. And they've showed that ingenuity in every foreign occupier. Most of the time it's been the Chinese, but they were using that same ingenuity when we went to war. And it was very evident along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, for those of you, there's probably just a few of you in here who have not heard about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it was a logistical supply line that the Vietnamese used to transport men and material from the north to the south. And the word trail is a misnomer because it actually started out as a single trail, but by the time we were fighting them, it expanded into a network of roads, primarily 7 north-south roads and dozens of east-west roads. And whenever we discovered the existence of one road and would start monitoring traffic there, they would simply slide over to another road. And they came up with some very ingenious ways of hiding these roads. Sometimes the part of the road that we discovered was something that they couldn't bypass. And let me back up a little bit because I had a conversation with a Chinese Vietnamese gentleman before I started interviewing these Vietnamese veterans, and he made reference. He said, "You must ask them about the invisible roads." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I can't tell you. You must learn from them." So every person I interviewed, I asked, "Can you tell me about the invisible roads?" And nobody could tell me. Well, finally, I interviewed a colonel who was a Binh Tran commander, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail was divided into sections called Binh Trans, and he was a commander of one of those Binh Trans. And when I asked him about the invisible roads, he got a big smile on his face, and he said, quote, "You cannot openly hide a road that is visible, but make the road invisible, and you can hide it in the open." That intrigued me. And I asked him to tell me what he meant. He said, "We knew that there were parts of the road that we couldn't find a way of circumventing, and you knew we couldn't find a way of circumventing, and we knew you were out there every day with your aerial observers monitoring the activity coming down the road. And if you saw tire tracks, you'd know that a convoy had come through there, so you'd start looking for the convoy." He said, "We looked at our maps one day, and we noticed that during the dry season, a number of the north-south roads we needed were paralleled by relatively shallow rivers. So we had our engineers come down and grade the riverbeds. And at night, we would send our convoys through the riverbeds. And then once they got into an area you didn't know about, they'd come back on the road and continue their transit. They did that for the entire war, and we never knew about it." We also knew that there were rivers they had to be crossing. And we knew there was only one way you can cross a river, and that's with a bridge. And they knew we knew that. So they would build that bridge for us, for the sole purpose of us having a bridge to attack and knock out. And then several kilometers upstream or downstream from that bridge, they would build their real bridge. And they came up with a concept called the submarine bridge. And for those of you who are familiar with Vietnam's waterways, they call them brown water for a reason. You can't see anything underneath the surface. They would build a bridge platform about a foot under the low water mark. And then when convoys came through, they would have guides stand on the edges of this bridge platform and guide the convoys through. And when we flew over the rivers, we could never see the bridges underneath them. They also came up with another bridge concept, the buoy bridge. And they used this mostly to transit rivers with their personnel. And they took literally thousands of truck inner tubes, interconnected them, put a bridge platform on top, had an air pump on either bank of a river, and at night they would turn these pumps on. The inner tubes would inflate, and it would lift the bridge platform out of the water. They'd secure the bridge in place and run foot traffic across it all night. Just before daybreak, they turn off the pumps, deflate the tires, and it would sink back beneath the water. Amazing ingenuity. What I had to say was one of my most stimulating interviews when I asked to interview the commanding general of the Ho Chi tunnels. Now, for those of you who served over there, you know what the Ho Chi tunnels were. It was an extensive network of tunnels, about 320 kilometers, located about 30 miles outside of Saigon. And the main focus of my interview had been to learn how they had constructed them, what life was like in the tunnels. It was fascinating the way that they built these things. I'll give you advance warning, I'm no artist. But what they would do is dig a series of what I would call dry wells. They had a 5-man team involved in each well. They'd dig it to a certain depth, and then the man at the bottom here would start digging this way. The man here would start digging this way. And they would listen for each other. And if they did it right, these would connect. Then they would fill this well in after they dug another one here and continue the process the same way, filling the well behind them. Can you imagine doing that for 320 kilometers? We first learned about these tunnels in 1965. In fact, I've forgotten the Army unit involved, but it was a hammer and anvil operation. And for those of you not familiar with that, there was a river here, and this was all jungle here. And there were boats here patrolling this waterway as the Army swept through here. And they were looking for Viet Cong. They knew they were active in there. They made the sweep all the way through and did not find anybody. So they turned around and swept back through. All of a sudden they started taking pot shots. The Viet Cong did. And they noticed somebody pop up from a hole in the ground. And they ran over after the person had gone back down. We're looking down in the hole. Somebody else pops up over here. and then shoots the people looking at this hatch. And before long, the Army's a little slower than the Marines were. They realized that this was an extensive network down there that these Viet Cong were hiding in. And so then it became a chess game. How do we get them out of there? Initially, once we knew that there was a tunnel network here, we started using tanks, and we drive them back and forth, hoping to collapse them. And it really was a chess game, because we would do one thing to try and destroy the tunnels. What do you think they would do to defeat that? Well, they would do that too, but they dig deeper, put the tunnels deeper. In a lot of cases, their tunnels had 3 levels. And I got a chance on many of my trips back to Vietnam to go to the Ho Chi tunnels, where they have maintained some of the tunnels for Westerners to look at. And they keep in mind they've widened these things for Westerners. I felt like a cork in a bottle. And I would not go down to the 3rd level. I stopped at 2. And to me, it's just inconceivable that you would have had them living in spaces like this. One other thing we did, we would find a tunnel and we'd throw tear gas down into it, and or smoke, to see where the smoke came up, or see if the tear gas would drive them out. And they again learned to counter that. What they would do is take out a handkerchief, and they were told to urinate in the handkerchief and put it up to their nose and mouth, and it would help to screen out the agents and the CS gas. And one fellow, a veteran I interviewed, said, "Believe me, when you guys threw CS down there, I had no problem urinating." I can believe him. But again, what they did to counter that, they would have a tunnel like this, and then they would put what I would call a U-drain, like one you see under your kitchen sink. And they would put water in here. And then when we threw CS, they would simply hold their breath and come back on the other side and avoid the contaminated area. It was a constant cat and mouse game. The gentleman I interviewed, who was the commander of the Ho Chi Tunnel Fighters, he said, I conducted attacks on targets in and around Saigon. He started rattling off a list of targets, and he said the Navy headquarters. I said, wait a minute, was that the U.S. Navy headquarters? And he looked at me and smiled and said yes. And I said, would that have been 1969? He smiled and said yes. And it turned out that this is the man who had masterminded an assassination attempt against my father when my father had commanded the naval forces in Vietnam. And I had obviously heard about the attack from my father, but it sent chills down my spine, 30-some years later, to be sitting across the table from somebody who tried to kill him. And when I got up from the interview, we stood up and shook hands, and he said, my father was still alive then. He said, when you see your father next, give him my apologies, but tell him I was only doing my job as a soldier. And I said, well, General, thank God you missed. I went home that evening and called my father and told him about it, and said, by the way, Dad, I gave him your new address. Fortunately, he had a good sense of humor. Let me conclude with some observations. Many of you have probably read Sun Tzu and know his principles of war. One of those that he espoused was you never engage an enemy unless you know that enemy first. You also have heard Tom Brokaw describe our World War II generation as America's greatest generation, which my father was part of, and I agree with that. But look at what the Vietnamese did in the generation and a half of soldiers that we fought. They defeated the Japanese, the French, the Americans, the Cambodians, and the Chinese. I think our biggest shortcoming in Vietnam was we failed to recognize the fact that just like our World War II generation was our greatest generation, we were fighting Vietnam's greatest generation. Thank you, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you. First of all, Colonel Zumwalt, thank you very much for your service to your country.
Thank you.
Everything you have done in this study and coming to visit with us this evening. This is just marvelous, and thank you for doing all that. I had two questions. First of all, was curious, in your conversations with the other parties, were you able to speak to them in their language, or what was the common language that you spoke in? Or are they fluent in English, et cetera? And then also I was wondering
Before you get to that second question, remember I'm a Marine, so I may not remember more than one question at a time.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Okay, but to answer that question, a good question, because several did speak English, but many didn't. And I was very fortunate in that when Saigon fell in 1975, there was a family of Vietnamese that we took into our home that we helped nurture and get jobs and go on to school and so forth. And one of them ended up going back to Vietnam in 1991 and has reestablished himself there. And I was very fortunate to have him accompany me on all these interviews. So it was somebody I trusted, and I knew I was getting the proper translation. Your second question?
And secondly, I was wondering about the Agent Orange issue. I've often wondered, with the enormous tragedies that we see as a result on our side, and that's with people who, in many cases, served about a year or maybe two, a couple of tours, limited periods of time. What must it have been like on their side? This was, after all, their homeland, and much of the Agent Orange was there on a permanent basis for them. What did you find about that, or that you could tell us?
That's an interesting question. The problem on the U.S. side was, for those of you who have followed the Agent Orange issue, for a long time the U.S. government would not recognize any correlation between a number of different cancers and exposure to Agent Orange. And it was just the opposite problem on the Vietnamese side. Every medical problem that anybody had was caused because of Agent Orange in the country. So you had these two extremes, and the truth obviously is somewhere in between. We obviously have taken a much more scientific approach to Agent Orange, and we've got a pretty good handle now on the types of cancers that are caused by exposure. I've got to brag about my father on this, because when he jumped into the Agent Orange issue, as I said, there was not a single cancer or illness that was recognized by the U.S. government. And there was a medical panel every 3 years that was evaluating the evidence to see whether or not that burden of proof could be overcome. My father threw himself into the Agent Orange issue. Here's somebody with no medical background. He studied every Agent Orange study he could find, ranch handers, things of that nature. And he showed how many of the studies were flawed. In other words, they were set up so that they knew the results ahead of time. And let me give you an example. People who served more than one tour were excluded from the studies. Now, if anything, if somebody who had more than one tour there would be more exposed to Agent Orange, and therefore it's necessary to include them. They also would not do the studies on the Army side. They do them on a battalion size unit and larger. Now, what's bad about that is it was the company size and smaller that were exposed to Agent Orange because of the providing the security around the fire bases and things of that nature. So it took a military person going through the civilian studies to show, look, you guys have screwed this whole thing up. Not only that, he looked at the medical board that was set up by the government most of the doctors on that board had worked for the same chemical companies that had manufactured Agent Orange. He did a pro bono study for the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and said, you need to disband that medical board ASAP and set up a group of independent doctors, which they did. My father's report identified, I think it was 26 cancers that he felt correlated to Agent Orange exposure. The first review this new board took, they recognized 3 of the 26. My father had hoped he'd live long enough to see all 26. I think they're up to 16 now. But, every time I hear that they've approved another disease or cancer for Agent Orange compensation, it does my heart good knowing my father would be happy with that. Yes, that's right. Right. And what is it? Spinal bifida,
Sir, I'm aware of what you're talking about. I've had prostate cancer triggered by Agent Orange. Question.
And I hope fully recovered now.
Well, as much as you can ever be. The treatments are complete. Now we just have to watch and wait.
Yeah.
But that was not where I was quite heading.
Well, our prayers are still with you. I also had prostate cancer, and mine. I've now been cancer-free for 7 years. My wife wanted assurances there was no brain damage, and when the doctor said there wasn't none, she wanted a second opinion. But again, I get no respect. I'm sorry. Go on.
Not a problem. In my case, the VA refused to give me what I considered proper treatment, so I took it outside. But that's a separate topic. Anyway, have they been seeing second and third generation effects? That's the question I was going for.
Yes, they have. Just like I mentioned in my opening remarks about my brother and his son that was born with severe learning disabilities, it's very prevalent in Vietnamese society, and they were living, breathing this stuff on a daily basis. The Viet Cong forces, the 9th Division in particular. In fact, the commanding officer of the 9th VC Division, whom I became very close to, passed away of cancer that, I think was obviously attributable to Agent Orange exposure as well. But the follow-on generations have been suffering it as well.
I guess I would question your last point, because with all the residue that we left in their country, following it down through their generations, it would say, I wasn't afflicted and I brought it home to my children and their children. I would think that my children would go out into the same places and run into the same residues and have the same exposure and therefore grow the same cancers or suffer the same injuries.
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm following the question, but if what you're asking is they would be the exact parallel, you're saying the mirror image of what's happening in this country? Okay, well, again, you got to keep in mind that the Vietnamese just don't have the medical capability to be able to even diagnose in some cases what a lot of these children are suffering from. Particularly the worst exposure was out in the country where there's very limited medical care. So you have a child who dies of cancer or some other thing, but nobody knows exactly what it is because there's nobody there who's diagnosed it as such. So I think you're right in that if they had the medical advantages that we have here, they would be able to get a better handle on how extensive this generation is suffering from that same exposure.
What was it that the Vietnamese feared most from us? Was it napalm, Agent Orange, aerial strikes, special forces? What did they fear the most?
I can't say I can focus on any one. They seem to take a lot of this in stride. We were bombing, as I said, their tunnels. And they learned, I was commenting to Paul this evening, one thing they learned, they're great observers of human conduct, human behavior. They looked at the first strike to come through. They would be in their tunnels. Then they'd wait to see how much time, what the interval was between the first strike and the second strike. And let's say it was 20 minutes. They then knew after that second strike, they could all come out, have a cigarette, talk to each other, and wait 20 minutes before the third strike came. Because we were doing things like that. We would repeat the interval. So they really learned to cope with what we were throwing at them. And a lot of the people I interviewed were people who were wearing hearing aids because they were just outside the kill radius of a B-52 bombing, and that's almost the worst place to be, particularly if you're in a tunnel, and they're suffering the hearing loss now. But I think no matter what the challenge was we threw at them, it was just like the chess match I was telling you about. We would do A, they would do B. We would do C, they would do D. It was always there was always something they could do to lessen the impact.
We had a question up front.
Well, thank you again, Colonel, for being here. This is really an eye-opener for a lot of us. I know me. When the Viet Cong, were they drafted? And the North Vietnamese, were they all drafted? And how long was their service till the end of the war, till they got killed? And I was just curious, how many actually served from 65 up to, roughly the end of the war?
I don't know how many served. I can tell you that they finally acknowledged that they had 3 million killed.
3 million.
3 million. Now that includes a civilian population too. So the numbers are probably more like 2 million military and 1 million civilian. So you gave me too many questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I was just trying to compare them to the U.S., where they probably average age around 18, 19, and they were told they're going to fight.
Whether it was voluntary or not. And
they weren't in for a year, I don't imagine.
No,
they
knew when they got into the service that their tour would either end by being killed or wounded. They were one of the things that was interesting that I discovered in my interviews is I tried to get specific dates when they were talking about things, and they couldn't give you specific dates. They could tell you, well, it was monsoon season or it was the dry season, because they could not focus on a day-by-day basis. Yeah. That can you imagine if you knew you were going to be out there for maybe 6 to 8 years? And anybody who served, I know I did. I kept that calendar on the wall. I got so many more days to serve here, and then I'm back home. They did not have that luxury, and so everything blended together. It may have been dry season and this year or monsoon season. So I think it was almost for their own, for their own psychological benefit that they did not look in terms of defining tours by time and dates.
They would have gone crazy, probably. Crazier.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Colonel, if I might ask, by any chance, did you ever gain any indication from them as to, was there ever a time when they felt that perhaps we the Americans, would have been in a position to prevail? I've heard summaries of things that happened around the time of the Tet Offensive. I was already back here at the time, and still remember to this day Walter Cronkite, announcing that we would never win the war, and just wonder if they ever felt from their side that they were in jeopardy of losing.
There were 2 times. I interviewed General Tran Van Tra, who commanded the Viet Cong forces. He said, Tet of 68, they were devastated. He said there was no way they could get back into the fight. And he said he kept hearing from Hanoi, look, the media is really saying this is a lost American cause, and you need to keep your nose to the grindstone. And he was shocked to see that America was calling Tet a loss. And, they were on the ropes. There's no doubt about it. He acknowledged that. He also was very upset with General Jap. Sorry, how can you forget a name like that? General Jap, because, they were supposed to get more involvement from the North, but it was just about completely a Viet Cong show, and they paid the price for it.
They basically threw everything they had.
Right. And the other time that we came close to breaking them was the Christmas bombings. That really did do a job on them. That was devastating not only to the military but to the civilian population as well. But there were 2 times in that war that if we had kept at it, we could have won. One thing that's interesting, I just wrote a column recently, and I based it on an incident that occurred early on during the Vietnam War, and I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but in February of 1965, the JCS asked Defense Secretary McNamara. Yeah. They wanted a private meeting with the President Johnson. He set it up, and it was just supposed to be the 5 members of the JCS in there with the President. As it turned out, there was a Marine Corps captain who went on to become a lieutenant general, General Cooper. But he was the aide to the CNO. He escorted the CNO to the White House and then was waiting outside. A few minutes later, CNO sticks his head out and says, "We need you. We got to show a map of Vietnam, and we don't have an easel." So this guy found himself in this meeting with the president and the 5 members of the JCS simply because he was serving as an easel for a map of Vietnam. So he was the one that was able to share this story. But anyway, he said that every member of the JCS went through and said, "Look, this war is not winnable as we're fighting it now. This is why," and referred to the map. Johnson didn't say a word. He waited till they were all finished, and he says, "Anybody else have anything to say?" And they said, "No, sir, that's it." Johnson stood up and called them every expletive in the book, called them cowards, and kicked them out of his office. The name of the article that this general wrote is "The Day It Became the Longest War," and I think that's a very accurate description because you had a president there who would not listen to his military advisors as to what he was doing. And guess what? That's happening again today.
Any comment on that none of those generals resigned or walked away?
Well, glad you asked that because I also addressed that in my article. I pointed out, let me just give you the gist of the article. I said, I don't know whether you've seen the documentary that's come out recently on Vietnam, but it shows the closing days of Vietnam and the pandemonium in April of '75 as the Vietnamese were North Vietnamese were driving south. And finally, the orders were given to the last military personnel there to get on board the helicopters and to beat feet out of there. They disobeyed that order and continued to help South Vietnamese get out along with their families. They waited as long as they could and then finally boarded the helicopters. Not a single man who violated that order was ever persecuted. And that was the right decision. What they displayed was moral courage. And it's difficult to punish somebody for exercising moral courage. I then told this story about the JCS during the Vietnam War, and they took moral courage only part way. They took it to have the meeting with the president to confront him one-on-one with what they felt was a bad decision. But when he kicked him out of the office, they then should have en masse, I feel, resigned. And that it would have been extremely difficult for Johnson to not rethink what he was doing had they done that. And I made the point that I am shocked with all that's going on in this country today and all the bad decisions being made that are committing our young men and women to battlefields by a man who knows nothing about warfare. And we do not have a single member of the JCS that will stand up to him and say, "Sir, you're making the wrong decision. Here's my resignation." Yes, sir.
I don't know if you have the answer for this. I went to Vietnam about 5 years ago on a cruise. And when I stepped ashore, I had the most incredible rush of emotions.
Is everybody able to hear his question?
Can you hear it? I had the most incredible rush of emotions when I stepped ashore in Vietnam. Have other people you've talked to said anything about that? I mean, it was overwhelming.
But was everybody able to hear the question?
The question was, I went to Vietnam about 5 years ago on a cruise. I had never been there before, not during the war, even though I'm retired military. And when I stepped off the ship onto Vietnam, I had the most incredible rush of emotions that I could have ever conceived of. Have other people you've talked to said anything about what it was like the first time they went to visit?
I've seen emotions both ways. I've seen some who have become very emotional, and I can understand that. The Vietnamese are very humble people. There's no doubt about it. You know, we fought what was our longest war at that point in time against them, but they welcome Americans as friends. Their fear is China. You know, they know that they've been at war with China every century, and that it's going to happen again. So they welcome us with open arms, and because there's such that feeling of camaraderie, a lot of these interviews I'd find after the interview, I'd turn the recorder off, and then we'd go out and have a drink somewhere. And after about 4 or 5 beers, you were hugging each other, and I mean, just the bonding was remarkable. But it really gave me an insight there that what the Vietnamese wanted was really no different than what we wanted. And that was to maintain a family, be happy in supporting that family, and doing what they wanted to do. What I found interesting, a lot of the people I also interviewed said the problem now is, and then they look around and make sure nobody was listening, is now we have to fight the communists. So, they really had the same desires in life that we have, but the only difference is we're allowed to do it a lot more freely than they are.
Last question? Yeah, last question there.
Did you talk to any Vietnamese who served in the Republic of South Vietnam Army or Air Force?
Yes, I have. In fact, several in the Navy. My father, when he was commanded the naval forces in Vietnam, became his Vietnamese brother was his counterpart, Admiral Chan, and that's another amazing story. Admiral Chan had retired, was in Vietnam, had become a minister in one of the religions over there. But as Saigon was beginning to fall, he assembled his family at his home, and his elderly parents in their 80s were there. And my father had arranged to get them flown out on one of the aircraft. And when he got the call to come to the airport, he looked over, and his mother and father were in tears. And he realized he couldn't take them from Vietnam. So he told the person on the phone, "Go without us." And he stayed back. His parents ended up dying about 3 years later, but he spent 12 years in a re-education camp. My father tried for those 12 years through the International Red Cross to get him out. He was released after 12 years, but not allowed to travel for 3 more. And finally, after 15 years, came to the United States. And when his plane arrived, there to greet him was my father. And it's amazing how that. Just one more story, and then I'll cut it off. But you want one story generates another. But I'll never forget when my father was dying of cancer. I would call Admiral Chan and give him regular reports. And when my father died, I picked up the phone. I called Admiral Chan, and I said, Admiral Chan, how are you? And he said, okay, your father died, didn't he? And I said, yes. And he said, last night I had a dream that we were on a ship, and the ship was going down, and your father pushed me through the open door to get out. I turned around to reach for him, and he shook his head and closed the door. He said, I knew your father had died. These men were so close that he told me before I could tell him that my father had died. And I think that is quite a testimonial to the bond that my father created with the Vietnamese when he was over there for his 1.5 years of service. And I'm awful proud of him. Thank you.
I think I can say with confidence he's proud of you, too. So we're cheap, as all of our regular our regulars know. But actually, we have two very small tokens of appreciation for a wonderful talk and a tremendous amount of courage, don't you think, for somebody who goes to talk to your enemy and figure out what makes them tick. So anyway, we're indebted to you for that. We have this environmentally correct drinking bottle, which is distinguishable from all others because this is the big...
Thank you very much.
Almost Marine Corps red, so... And then we've got another thing here. I talked to you about this book, okay, so you know, but this is, we just released this in June. This is Bill Hoponsky's memoir of commanding the Quarter Cav, 1st Squadron, 4th Cavalry, 1st Infantry Division in 1969. It's tremendous. Bill Hoponsky has done a fantastic job of research. He would shoot me if he heard me call it a memoir. Worked with a whole bunch of veterans, did all kinds of research in the National Archives. But the reason I'm giving it to Jim, and I think he'll appreciate it, is that unlike so many histories of the war in Vietnam, Bill tried to get in the heads of the guys that he was fighting. And he went to great lengths, including hiring a retired CIA officer who was fluent in Vietnamese to look at Vietnamese documents and interview Vietnamese veterans. And so he tells his side, and then he shifts voice and tries to tell what was going on in the minds and the experiences of his opponent. And I think it's really well done. And I can't think of anyone better to have a copy than you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it.
Why don't you have a seat? Oh, no, if you'll go back to JD.
All right.
We'll get you set up. Okay, quick administrative announcements. One is we have a bunch of Jim's signed copies of Jim's book that are available in the back here. After we're done, we have evaluation forms at the coffee stand that we'd like you to fill out, please, because we want to know how we're doing and how we can do it better. This is our next event, the Gold Star Mother Pilgrimage of the 1930s, November 5th at 7:30 p.m. Also here, this is the story of the government's effort to, quite frankly, appease some of the mothers of soldiers who did not return from World War I by providing them passage across the Atlantic in the 1930s to go to the battlefields and try to find the graves of their sons. A very, very moving account of that. Next slide, please. And, of course, as always, if you don't know about the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Vets in Wheaton, you can pick up literature at the veteran table, and there's a red, white, and blue mailbox with a slot in the top, and we will gladly accept any donation, small or large, from Cantini Post 556 of the American Legion. We'll make sure that that goes to this wonderful grassroots 501c3 organization that's trying to address a real problem for our veterans today, and that is a lot of them don't have a place to go home. Thank you for coming to Cantini, and I will see you around the campus.